Welcome to Whispers in the Dark, the place where spine-chilling true stories unfold. Tonight, we bring you a terrifying tale of a forest that's not just alive with trees, but with something far darker: figurines, strange occurrences. If you're already hooked and need more true horror from the darkest corners of the internet, don't forget to hit that like button. It helps us reach more horror fans like you, and keeps us bringing these creepy, true stories to your feed. Follow us for more, because you never know what secrets the shadows hold.
It started as a celebration. Graduation was just around the corner, and the future stretched before us like an open road. For 4 years, we'd shared everything: lectures, parties, breakups, late-night study sessions, and early morning hangovers. It felt impossible to imagine a life where we weren't all together, where we couldn't text each other at a moment's notice, or gather at Jake's apartment for another beer-fueled debate about nothing in particular. Sarah was the one who came up with the idea. Of course she was. Bridger-Teton National Forest, she announced, slapping a glossy brochure onto Jake's coffee table like a winning hand in a card game. 3.4 million acres of pure wilderness. No Wi-Fi, no deadlines, just us and the trees. One last hurrah before we all get sucked into the grind of real life. Her enthusiasm was a force of nature, as unstoppable as a river carving through rock. It pulled you in whether you wanted it to or not. Jake, lounging on the couch with a can of beer in hand, raised an eyebrow. 3.4 million acres? That's huge. Like, get lost and die of starvation huge. He grinned at Sarah, who rolled her eyes. Only if you're an idiot, she shot back. Which, granted, is a possibility for you. Jake feigned offense, pressing a hand to his chest. You wound me. Their banter was constant, as familiar as breathing. Jake and Sarah had been dating for 2 years, and though their personalities often clashed like cymbals, they were inseparable. Jake's easygoing charm tempered Sarah's fiery determination, and Sarah's relentless drive kept Jake from floating through life like an untethered balloon. Matt, sitting across the room in one of Jake's mismatched chairs, chuckled softly. It does sound pretty remote. Remote is the point, Sarah replied, turning her attention to him. Come on, Matt, back me up here. Matt shrugged, his smile easy. I don't think you need backup. I glanced at him, my nerves gnawing at the edges of my thoughts. Matt and I had been together for almost 2 years, and I loved him truly, deeply. But I couldn't stop thinking about the test buried at the bottom of my backpack, still in its box. I wasn't ready to know. Matt caught my eye and gave me that small, steady smile of his, the one that always seemed to ground me. Lisa? Sarah said, her gaze snapping to me. You in? I hesitated, glancing at Matt again. It could be fun, he said, his voice calm and low, meant just for me. And just like that, the last of my resistance crumbled. Fine, I said, forcing a smile. I'm in. The 4 of us had met during our first year at college, though not all at once. Sarah and I had clicked immediately. We met on the first day of orientation, thrown together by the chaos of late arrivals and misplaced schedules. I liked her, Sarah, and I had clicked immediately. We met on the first day of orientation, thrown together by the chaos of late arrivals and misplaced schedules. I liked her instantly, even though she scared me a little. She was bold and unapologetic, the kind of person who could light up a room or burn it down, depending on her mood. Jake came into the picture a few weeks later. He and Sarah met at a party, where she claimed he'd spilled beer on her shoes and tried to laugh it off. She retaliated by making him buy her a replacement pair, and somehow, that argument had turned into flirting. By the time they officially started dating, Jake had become a permanent fixture in our lives. It was hard not to like Jake. He had a quick wit and a laid-back attitude that made everything seem a little less serious. He didn't take life too seriously, and when you were around him, you didn't either. Matt was the last to join our group. Sarah had dragged me to a party, one of the loud, sweaty ones where you have to shout to be heard over the music. I was ready to leave when I spotted him sitting in the corner, nursing a beer and watching the chaos with quiet amusement. "You look like you could use some friends," Sarah said, planting herself in front of him with her usual confidence. He raised an eyebrow. "Do I?" "Yeah," she said with a smirk. "Lucky for you, we're great at it." To my surprise, he stayed. It wasn't long before he and I started spending more time together, grabbing coffee, walking to class, sitting together in the library during long study sessions. He wasn't loud or flashy, but he didn't need to be. There was a quiet strength to him, a steadiness that made you feel like the world wasn't so overwhelming after all. The planning for the trip took on a life of its own. Sarah, naturally, took charge. She started texting us lists within an hour of deciding we were going, complete with suggestions for which trails to hike and what gear to bring. "Bear spray?" Jake said, holding up his phone when we met at the campus coffee shop a few days later. "Are you serious?" "Dead serious," Sarah replied without looking up from her laptop. "Unless you want to end up as Bear Chow." Jake snorted. "I'll take my chances." "Your funeral," Sarah said, smirking. Matt and I were put in charge of the practical stuff: tents, sleeping bags, cooking equipment. Jake, predictably, was responsible for food and drinks. "Don't just bring beer," Sarah warned him. "You wound me," Jake said again, pressing a hand to his chest. "What kind of animal do you think I am?" "A lazy one," Sarah quipped. The banter flowed easily, comfortably. It reminded me why I loved this group, why I couldn't imagine life without them. But underneath the excitement, I couldn't shake the weight in my chest. The day we left, the sun was already high in the sky, and Jake's old Toyota Land Cruiser was parked in his driveway, looking like it had survived a war or two. Sarah stood beside it, hands on her hips as she surveyed the growing pile of gear. "Do we really need all this?" she asked, raising an eyebrow at the cooler Jake was wrestling into the back. "Absolutely," Jake said, wiping sweat from his brow. "Survival essentials." Sarah rolled her eyes but didn't argue. Matt appeared beside me, sliding his arm around my waist. "You ready?" he asked. I nodded, though my heart was pounding. "Yeah." "Lisa," Sarah called, already climbing into the passenger seat. "Let's go." I climbed into the back with Matt, the engine rumbling beneath us as Jake cranked the stereo. The car smelled like old leather and the faint tang of motor oil. As we pulled out of the driveway, laughter and music filled the air. For a moment, it was easy to forget the worries I'd buried deep, to let myself believe that this trip would be exactly what Sarah promised it would be. Jake cranked up the stereo as we pulled out of the driveway, a blast of Everlong by Foo Fighters filling the car. "Now this," he declared, "is the perfect road trip anthem." "You mean perfect for you," Sarah said, perched in the passenger seat with her feet propped on the dash. She glanced over her shoulder at me and Matt in the back. "What do we think, team? Classic or cringe?" "Classic," Matt said, without hesitation. "Cringe," I replied at the same time. Jake groaned, throwing up one hand in mock despair. "You guys wouldn't know a good song if it hit you in the face." "You mean like your taste in music?" Sarah quipped, her grin sharp. I couldn't help but laugh. This was Jake and Sarah in a nutshell, bickering, teasing, always pushing each other's buttons. But beneath it all, there was an ease to them, an unspoken rhythm that made their constant sparring less like a battle and more like a dance. "Fine," Jake said, pretending to sulk. "What's your pick, oh mighty Sarah?" She reached for her phone, scrolling through her playlist with the confidence of someone who knew exactly what she wanted. A few moments later, the opening chords of Ironic by Alanis Morissette filled the car. "Seriously?" Jake said, his voice heavy with disbelief. "This is your road trip song?" "It's iconic," Sarah shot back, tilting her chin defiantly. "It's depressing," Jake countered. "It's truth," Sarah corrected, smirking. Matt chuckled beside me, his arm resting casually along the back of my seat. "What about you, Lisa?" he asked, his voice soft enough that only I could hear. "Oh, I've got the best taste in the car," I said confidently. "Big claim," he teased, his brown eyes warm. "Fleetwood Mac," I said, meeting his gaze. "The Eagles." "Elton John." Matt smiled, his fingers brushing against my shoulder. "Solid choices." "Boring choices," Jake called from the front, somehow overhearing us. "Come on, Lisa. Live a little." Coming from the guy who thinks Limp Bizkit is underrated, I shot back. The car erupted in laughter, Jake protesting loudly as Sarah leaned over to turn the music up even louder. The laughter carried us through the first leg of the journey, filling the car with warmth and familiarity. Outside, the landscape began to shift. The suburbs fell away, replaced by rolling fields that stretched out under a wide, cloudless sky. The grass was tall and golden, swaying gently in the breeze, and every so often, we'd pass a barn or a silo standing solitary against the horizon. I rested my head against the window, letting the soft hum of the car and the distant chatter of my friends wash over me. The fields seemed to go on forever, endless and open, and for the first time in weeks, I felt like I could breathe. "Look at that," Matt said, nodding toward a cluster of hills in the distance. The land began to rise and fall in gentle slopes, dotted with wildflowers that painted splashes of yellow and purple against the green. Fences lined the road now, their weathered wood leaning at odd angles, and the occasional cow or horse would lift its head lazily as we passed. "It's beautiful," I said softly. Sarah turned to look out the window, her expression unusually quiet. "You're not wrong." Jake squinted at the horizon, shading his eyes with one hand. "Bet you $10 there's a brewery somewhere out there." "Is that all you think about?" Sarah asked, rolling her eyes. "Beer and good vibes, baby," Jake said, grinning. The road began to curve, winding its way through a patch of dense trees. They weren't the towering pines we'd been expecting, these were smaller, their leaves bright green in the sunlight, almost shimmering as they danced in the breeze. "This feels more like it," Sarah said, her grin returning, getting closer to the good stuff. As the hours passed, the scenery shifted again. The trees grew taller, their trunks thicker and darker, their branches stretching higher into the sky. The road narrowed, flanked on either side by clusters of greenery that seemed to hum with life. The sunlight filtered through the canopy above, casting dappled patterns on the asphalt. The air felt cooler now, carrying with it the faint scent of pine and damp earth. Jake slowed the car slightly, his gaze flicking between the road and the trees. "Okay, I'll admit it. This is pretty cool." "Just wait," Sarah said, her excitement bubbling up again. "This is nothing compared to what's coming." Matt leaned closer to the window, his expression thoughtful. "It's amazing how different everything feels out here." I nodded, my fingers absently playing with the hem of my sleeve. There was something about the landscape that felt untouched, raw, in a way that was hard to describe. It wasn't just beautiful, it was alive. Vibrant in a way that made the world we'd left behind seem pale and flat in comparison. Jake's Toyota Land Cruiser rumbled along the winding road, a steady hum beneath the chaos of the car's interior. The stereo was still blaring Semi-Charmed Life by Third Eye Blind this time, and Jake was singing along with exaggerated enthusiasm, completely off-key. "Do you have to ruin everything good about the 90s?" Sarah asked from the passenger seat, shooting him a mock glare. "You mean improve it?" Jake retorted, winking. "Lisa," Sarah called over her shoulder, her voice carrying above the music. "Back me up. Isn't this the most painful thing you've ever heard?" "Close," I said, grinning. "But that time you tried karaoke after 4 tequila shots still wins." Matt chuckled beside me, his arm draped casually over the back of my seat. "I don't know. Jake's got a certain charm." "Traitor," I said, nudging him lightly. Sarah reached forward and turned the volume down slightly. "All right, music critic. What's next on the playlist?" Jake opened his mouth to respond, but Sarah suddenly groaned loudly, pressing her stomach. "Oh no," she said, her voice dramatic. "We need to stop. Emergency bathroom break." The car burst into groans and protests. "Seriously?" Jake asked, glancing over at her. "Can't you hold it for like another hour?" "Do you want me to pee on your dashboard?" Sarah shot back, her tone sharp but laced with humor. Jake sighed theatrically, slowing the car as he scanned the roadside for a safe spot to pull over. "Fine, but you're paying for the detailing if this goes sideways." "Relax," Sarah said, grinning. "I've got it under control." Jake pulled the Land Cruiser onto a gravel turnout surrounded by trees. The sound of the tires crunching on loose rocks echoed in the stillness as the engine cut off. "This is so embarrassing," I muttered, as Sarah grabbed a roll of toilet paper from the back and hopped out of the car. She smirked, leaning into the open window. "Nature calls, Lisa. Don't fight it." I rolled my eyes as she disappeared into the woods, leaving the rest of us in awkward silence. Jake tapped a rhythm on the steering wheel, his eyes darting toward the tree line. "You know," he said, breaking the quiet, "this is how every horror movie starts." Matt shook his head, smiling faintly. "Come on, Jake. Don't start." "I'm just saying," Jake replied, his grin wide. "Remote forest, no cell service. Girl goes off alone. Classic setup." "Jake, I swear," I said, leaning forward. "If you scare her and she takes it out on me, you're walking the rest of the way." Jake laughed, holding up his hands in mock surrender. "Fine, fine. No jokes. Scout's honor." The sound of Sarah's return was a relief. She hopped back into the passenger seat, tossing the toilet paper into the back. "Crisis averted," she said cheerfully. Jake turned the key, and the engine rumbled back to life. "All right, team, back to the road." The laughter resumed, but it felt lighter this time, almost forced, as if the forest had crept into our heads. Outside, the trees seemed taller, their trunks thicker, their branches leaning inward like silent sentinels. The road narrowed further, the daylight dimming as the canopy overhead grew denser. The stereo continued to play, but the jokes began to fade, replaced by quiet conversations and stolen glances out the windows. "Almost there," Sarah said, her voice quieter now. I glanced at Matt, his hand still resting on the back of my seat. He met my gaze and gave me a reassuring smile, but I couldn't shake the unease settling in my chest. "We're here." It's hard to put into words how enormous this place feels. Pictures didn't do it justice. Even the drive-in, with its endless lines of trees and winding roads, couldn't prepare me for this. Bridger-Teton is vast in a way that makes you feel like you've stepped into another world. Like the forest has swallowed you whole and decided to keep you. The trees seem to go on forever, tall and ancient, their trunks thick and gnarled, their branches so dense they blot out most of the sky. The sunlight that does break through is soft and fragmented, pooling on the forest floor in patches of gold. Everything smells alive, pine and earth, and something faintly sweet, like wildflowers blooming somewhere just out of sight. "Wow," Matt says quietly, standing beside me. His voice is low, almost reverent. "It's something," I reply, though I'm not sure if I mean it in a good way or not. "Okay, I take it back," Jake announces from the driver's seat, sticking his head out the window. "This is actually kind of cool. Like, hey, I might survive the week and enjoy it cool." Sarah hops out of the passenger seat, stretching her arms above her head. "Admit it, Jake, I was right." "Let's not go that far," Jake replies, grinning as he climbs out. Sarah says, smirking. She plants her hands on her hips and surveys the clearing like she's already decided it's hers. "This is perfect. We'll set up here." The spot Sarah picked is close to a stream, a narrow, winding ribbon of water that glitters in the sunlight. The sound of it fills the clearing, soft and constant, as it trickles over smooth stone. It's shallow enough to see the bottom, the rocks worn round and flat by the current, their colors muted but beautiful. Earthy reds, soft grays, hints of mossy green. The air feels cooler here, fresher, like the stream has its own kind of energy. I crouch beside it for a moment, letting the cold water run over my fingers. It's so clear I can see tiny fish darting between the rocks, their movements quick and precise. "Don't fall in," Matt says behind me, his tone teasing. I glance back at him, smiling. "What? And ruin my perfect record of clumsiness?" He chuckled, and for a moment, the knot in my chest eases. Setting up camp turns into its own kind of chaos. "Jake, grab the poles," Sarah orders, already unpacking their tent with military precision. Jake salutes her dramatically. "Yes, ma'am." It takes all of 2 minutes for him to trip over the poles and collapse into the dirt with a loud groan. "Man down," he calls, flopping onto his back. "Go on without me. Tell my parents I died bravely." "Or clumsily," Sarah says, rolling her eyes. Jake grins up at her. "You love it." Sarah throws a tent peg at him, and he catches it effortlessly before sitting up. "You're lucky you're cute," she says, shaking her head as she gets back to work. Matt, as usual, is the quiet one. He's already unpacked our tent and is busy hammering stakes into the ground with methodical precision. His t-shirt clings to his back as he works, and I try not to get distracted by the way the muscles in his arms flex with each swing. "You're staring," he says without looking up. "Am not," I lie, crossing my arm. He glances over his shoulder, a small smile tugging at the corners of his mouth. Sarah's tent is the first to go up, though not without its share of arguments about who did more work. Ours follows shortly after, thanks mostly to Matt's efficiency. "Not bad," I say as he ties off the last guy line. "Not bad?" he repeats, pretending to look offended. "This is a masterpiece." I laugh, brushing a strand of hair out of my face, as I step back to admire our handiwork. It's a little crooked, but it'll do. Jake, meanwhile, has decided to inspect the stream, tossing rocks into the water like a bored kid. "Hey," he calls, grinning. "What do you think the over-under is on Sarah falling in before the week's out?" "I'm standing right here," Sarah replies, her hands on her hips. "And I still think it's good odds," Jake says, laughing. By the time the tents are up and the gear is unpacked, the light has started to shift. The sun dips lower in the sky, casting long shadows across the clearing. The forest around us hums with life, the soft rustle of leaves, the distant call of a bird, the steady sound of the stream. There's a stillness to it, a kind of quiet that feels deeper than anything I've ever known. It's peaceful, but it's also something else. I catch Sarah standing at the edge of the clearing, staring into the trees. Her usual bravado is gone, replaced by something quieter, more thoughtful. "What's on your mind?" I ask, walking over to join her. She shrugs, her gaze still fixed on the forest. "Just thinking how big this place is. Makes you feel small, doesn't it?" I nod, though I don't say what I'm really thinking. That it's not just the size of the forest that's unsettling. It's the way it seems to close in around us, like it's watching. But that's ridiculous, isn't it? The first night felt like the start of something perfect. The fire burned high, licking at the night with bright, crackling fingers. And the smell of wood smoke mingled with the clean, piney air of the forest. Sparks spiraled upward, dancing briefly in the black void above before disappearing into the dark. The four of us sat in a loose circle around the fire, legs stretched out, ears in hand, letting the warmth seep into our skin. Jake had just finished unpacking the cooler, triumphantly pulling out a slightly squashed bag of marshmallows. "S'mores time, people," he announced, grinning like he'd just uncovered buried treasure. "Where's the chocolate?" Sarah asked, raising an eyebrow. Jake froze, his grin faltering. "Shit. You forgot the chocolate?" Sarah said, her tone a perfect mix of disbelief and amusement. "I brought beer," Jake protested, holding up a can like it was a peace offering. "And forgot half the point of s'mores," I added, laughing. Matt shook his head, tossing Jake a long stick. "You're on roasting duty. Make yourself useful." Jake grumbled good-naturedly, skewering a marshmallow and holding it over the fire. The smell of it roasting a sweet, sugary scent that grew richer as the edges began to brown filled the air, making up for the lack of chocolate. We laughed and talked as the firelight painted our faces in flickering shades of orange and gold. It felt easy, natural, the way things always did when it was just the four of us. As the night deepened, the laughter quieted, replaced by the gentle crackle of the fire and the soft hum of the forest. The sounds of the world beyond felt far away, no cars, no hum of distant planes, just the occasional rustle of leaves or the low hoot of an owl somewhere in the trees. Jake leaned back, his arms stretched out behind him, and pulled a joint from the pocket of his jacket. "Time to elevate this experience," he said, grinning as he held it up like it was some kind of sacred artifact. Sarah rolled her eyes, but there was no real disapproval in it. "You're such a cliché." "Guilty as charged," Jake said, lighting it with a practiced flick of his lighter. The sharp, earthy smell of burning weed mixed with the wood smoke. A pungent, almost skunky scent that lingered in the cool air. He took a long drag, exhaling slowly and watching the smoke curl upward before passing it to Sarah. She waved it off. "Come on," Jake said, his grin widening. "Live a little, babe." "I'll pass," Sarah said, leaning back on her elbows. "I'd rather keep my head clear. Someone has to make sure you don't wander off into the woods." "Wise," Matt murmured, shaking his head as Jake offered it to him. Jake shrugged and took another drag before passing it to me. I hesitated for a moment, then took it. The smoke was harsh and hot as it filled my lungs, burning in a way that wasn't entirely unpleasant. I coughed, handing it back to Jake, who laughed and clapped me on the back. "That's the spirit," he said, grinning. The fire burned lower as the night stretched on, the logs collapsing into glowing embers. The shadows beyond the circle of light seemed to deepen, thickening with every passing minute. Sarah leaned forward, her face illuminated by the firelight, her grin taking on a mischievous edge. "You know," she began, her voice low and conspiratorial, "they say people disappear in forests like this." "Oh, here we go," Jake said, leaning back and exhaling a plume of smoke. "I'm serious," Sarah continued, ignoring him. "Between 2018 and the first 2 months of 2023, over 1,000 people went missing in U.S. national parks. No trace, no footprints, no nothing. Just gone." The words hung in the air, heavier than the smoke. "Like aliens?" Jake asked, snorting. "Or ghosts," Sarah said, her grin widening. "Or maybe," Matt said quietly, "the forest itself takes them." The humor in Jake's expression faltered for just a moment, replaced by something else. "Creepy, man." "I'm just saying," Matt added, his tone calm but deliberate. "Places like this, they've been here a lot longer than us. Makes you wonder what they've seen, what they've buried." "Okay, no," I said quickly, my laugh sounding more forced than I meant it to. "Let's not make this weird." Sarah's gaze shifted to me, her grin softening. "Come on, Lisa. It's just a story." "Yeah," Jake added, his smirk returning. "And besides, if the forest wants someone, it'll probably take me first. Clearly the most valuable asset here." The laugh that followed felt hollow, like it didn't quite reach any of us. The fire continued to crackle, but it seemed quieter now, like the forest itself was listening. The shadows beyond the clearing felt darker, heavier, as though the night was leaning in to press against the edges of our little circle. The flickering light played tricks on my eyes, turning the trees into towering figures that swayed and shifted in the breeze. A branch snapped somewhere in the distance, a sharp, sudden crack that made all of us freeze. The fire burned low, its once bright flames now reduced to glowing embers that pulsed faintly in the dark. The air had turned cooler, and the steady hum of the forest grew louder as the night deepened, crickets chirping in the underbrush, the occasional rustle of leaves stirred by the breeze. "Calling it," Jake announced, stretching his arms above his head and letting out a loud yawn. "If I don't get some sleep, I'll be useless tomorrow." And by useless, I mean more useless than usual. Sarah rolled her eyes, already gathering the empty beer cans and tossing them into a small bag. "You're not wrong," she said, smirking. Matt stood, brushing dirt off his jeans, and offered me a hand. "Coming?" I nodded, sliding my fingers into his. His hand was warm, strong, and it steadied me in a way I didn't quite understand. "Night losers," Jake called as he ducked into his tent, pulling the zipper closed behind him with a sharp zip. "Don't snore too loud," Sarah shouted after him, grinning. She turned to me, her expression softening. "Night, Lisa." "Night," I said, returning her smile. Matt and I made our way to our tent, the cool air brushing against my skin and sending a faint shiver down my spine. He held the flap open for me, and I ducked inside, the fabric rustling faintly as it settled behind us. The tent smelled of earth and the faint, comforting scent of Matt's cologne, mingling with the clean, piney air of the forest. The sleeping bags were spread out, their synthetic fabric crinkling softly as we settled in. Matt lay on his side, propped up on one elbow, his face calm and relaxed in the dim light of the small camping lantern we'd hung above us. "You okay?" he asked, his voice quiet. "Yeah," I said, though my chest felt tight. "Big day tomorrow," he said, brushing a strand of hair away from my face. "Get some sleep." I nodded, offering him a small smile. He kissed my forehead, then lay back, one arm draped loosely across his stomach as he closed his eyes. I turned onto my side, facing away from him, and stared at the faint shadows playing across the fabric of the tent. My mind wouldn't quiet. The pregnancy test sat like a weight in the bottom of my backpack, tucked away where no one could find it. I hadn't opened it yet, hadn't even touched it since I packed it. It felt like a secret too big to confront, a truth I wasn't ready to face. What would Matt say? What would he do if it was positive? I thought about the way he'd smiled at me earlier, calm and sure, like he always was. That was Matt Steady, dependable, the kind of person who made you believe everything would be okay. But this wasn't a late assignment or a flat tire. This was life. Would he be ready? Would I? A part of me felt a flicker of warmth at the thought, a tiny spark of something that felt suspiciously like happiness. The idea of a life growing inside me, a future that was ours, was overwhelming but not entirely unwelcome. But then the doubt crept in, thick and smothering. What if it wasn't the right time? What if he didn't want this? I squeezed my eyes shut, trying to push the thoughts away, but they stuck, clinging to the edges of my mind like cobwebs. A soft sound broke the quiet. At first, I thought it was the wind, a faint rustling that seemed to move through the trees. But then it came again, closer this time, sharper. The crack of a branch snapping underfoot. My breath caught, and I froze, my ears straining against the silence. Another sound followed, a low, rhythmic rustling, like something moving slowly through the underbrush. It was too deliberate to be the wind, too slow and heavy to be a small animal. "Matt," I whispered, my voice barely audible. He didn't stir, his breathing slow and even, the rise and fall of his chest steady. I turned my head toward the tent's entrance, staring at the thin fabric that separated us from whatever was outside. The fire was out now, the clearing plunged into darkness, and the only light came from the faint glow of the lantern above us. The sound came again, closer still, and my stomach twisted into a tight knot. Should I get up? Check? No, that was ridiculous. It was probably nothing, a raccoon, maybe, or the wind shifting through the trees. That's all it was. But I couldn't shake the feeling that something was out there, watching. I held my breath, waiting for the sound to come again, but the forest had gone still. The quiet was heavy, oppressive, pressing down on me until it felt like I couldn't move. "It's nothing," I whispered to myself, though the words felt hollow. Slowly, the tension began to ebb, my body loosening as exhaustion crept in. I pulled the sleeping bag tighter around me, my eyelids growing heavier with each passing moment. The forest hummed softly in the background, its sounds blurring into a lulling rhythm. Eventually, sleep overtook me. But just before I drifted off, I thought I heard it again, a faint, distant rustling, too soft to be sure. And then, silence. Morning crept in slowly. The forest wrapped in a cold, damp quiet. The fire had died sometime in the night, leaving behind only pale ash and the faint, acrid smell of smoke. I was the first to rise, pulling on my jacket and stepping outside the tent. The air bit at my skin, fresh and sharp with the scent of pine, as sunlight filtered through the trees in fractured beams. I crouched by the fire pit, my fingers clumsy with the damp matches, as I tried to coax a flame from the kindling. Each failed attempt brought a new wave of frustration, but I pressed on. Behind me, I heard the soft rasp of a zipper as Matt emerged from the tent. His hair was tousled from sleep, his face soft and warm in the morning light. He stretched, his breath puffing out in little clouds. "Morning," he said, his voice low and groggy, Morning, I replied, not looking up from the stubborn pile of sticks and ash in front of me. He rubbed the back of his neck, looking around. Need any help? I've got it, I muttered, though the fire pit remained as cold as the air around us. All right, he said with a faint chuckle. I'm gonna go find a spot to you know. Thanks for the update, I called after him. But my focus was still on the fire, willing it to catch. It wasn't long before his voice broke through the quiet, sharp and excited. Lisa, hey, come look at this. The urgency in his tone sent a flicker of unease through me. I stood, brushing dirt from my hands, and turned toward the sound of his voice. What is it? I called back, glancing toward the other tent where Jake and Sarah were beginning to stir. Just come here. Matt was standing at the edge of the clearing when I reached him, his posture stiff with curiosity. His gaze was fixed upward, his face half lit by the dappled sunlight breaking through the trees. What's going on? I asked, stepping beside him. He nodded toward the branches of the tree in front of us. Look. At first, I didn't see it. The morning light was soft and uneven, casting long shadows that seemed to blend the branches into the forest beyond. But then my eyes adjusted, and I saw them. Tiny wooden figures, dangling from the lowest branches, swaying gently in the breeze. They were carved with surprising detail, rough at first glance, but unnervingly specific as I stepped closer. My breath caught. The figures were us. Jake's baseball cap was unmistakable, perched on the head of one figure. Beside it hung another carving that perfectly captured Sarah, down to the hiking boots she wore every time we went outdoors. And then there was Matt, his strong jaw and familiar, slightly cocky smile, rendered in the grain of the wood. But it was the fourth figure that made my stomach twist. It was me. At first, it seemed simple enough, me hair tied back the way it always was, my jacket sketched out in uneven lines. But then I noticed the shape. The small, rounded belly carved into the figure's form. Pregnant. I took an involuntary step back, my hand flying to my stomach. How? I whispered, my voice trembling. My chest felt tight, my breath shallow. How could it show that? No one knew. Not even Matt. The test was still buried in my backpack, untouched, unanswered. I hadn't told a soul, hadn't even fully admitted it to myself. Did one of you do this? Sarah's voice cut through my thoughts, sharp and accusing. I turned to see her and Jake approaching, both of them staring at the carvings with unease. No, I said quickly, too quickly. Sarah crossed her arms, her expression hardening. Okay, then who did? Because this is too weird to be random. Come on, Jake said, stepping closer to inspect the figures. It's probably Matt. Quiet guy, good with his hands. Wants to freak us out before breakfast. Am I right? Matt frowned, turning to Jake with a glare. I didn't do this. Really? Sarah said, narrowing her eyes. Because it seems like exactly the kind of thing you'd pull. Stop it, I snapped, stepping between them. Matt wouldn't do something like this. Sarah raised an eyebrow. How do you know? Because, I said, pointing at the ground beneath the tree. Look, the ground's untouched. If someone had climbed up there to hang those things, there'd be footprints, disturbed, dirt something. Matt nodded, his voice calm but firm. She's right, the ground hasn't been touched. Sarah hesitated, glancing at the ground before turning her gaze back to the carvings. Okay, but then how did they get there? They didn't just appear out of nowhere. If they'd been there yesterday, we would have noticed, I said, my voice growing steadier. You don't miss something like this. Jake let out a low whistle, stepping back with a faint shake of his head. So what? Someone snuck in during the night and did this? Or something? The four of us stood in silence, staring up at the figures. The gentle sway of the carvings seemed too deliberate, their strings creaking faintly in the breeze. I say we take them down, Jake muttered, reaching toward one of the strings. Don't, Sarah said quickly, her voice sharp. Jake froze, raising an eyebrow. Why not? Just don't touch them, Sarah said, her arms tightening around herself. Jake hesitated for a moment, then stepped back with a shrug. Fine. They're creepy as hell anyway. We left the figures hanging, their crude, familiar shapes etched into my mind as we walked back to the clearing. The sunlight felt colder now, the warmth of the morning slipping away with every step. At the campsite, Sarah busied herself with breakfast, her movements stiff and deliberate. Jake muttered something about coffee, though his usual sarcasm was gone. Matt sat beside me, his leg pressed against mine. He glanced at me, his brow furrowed. You okay? I nodded, though the truth was harder to admit. My mind kept circling back to the figuresque, the impossible detail of my carving, the small, rounded belly that it shouldn't have had. How did they know? After breakfast, the fire burned low again, reduced to faint crackles as the last of the wood smoldered into embers. None of us lingered near it for long. The figurines still hung in the tree at the edge of the clearing, swaying gently in the breeze, and though no one mentioned them, their presence gnawed at the edges of our thoughts. Jake clapped his hands together and forced a grin that was too wide, too bright. All right, folks, he said, standing. Let's shake off the creepy vibes and get moving. Who's up for following the stream and seeing where it leads? Sounds good, Sarah said, her voice a little too quick, too eager. She brushed her hands on her jeans and gave Jake a sharp look. But no more theatrics. Last thing we need is you slipping and breaking something. Me? Slipping? Never, Jake declared, overdoing it as usual. Matt looked at me, his gaze steady. You up for it? Yeah, I said, though the tightness in my chest hadn't eased since we'd found the figurines. Still, sitting by the fire and staring at those things wasn't an option. Moving felt like the only way to keep the unease at bay. The stream wound its way through the forest like a silver thread, its clear water bubbling over smooth stones. It wasn't deep, just wide enough to force us to choose between hopping from bank to bank or wading through the icy shallows. Jake, predictably, went straight into the water, his boots sloshing loudly with every step. Come on, he called, grinning back at us. The water's refreshing. It's freezing, Sarah muttered, staying firmly on the bank. Refreshing, Jake insisted, winking. The sunlight filtered through the canopy above, dappling the water with shifting patterns of gold and green. The forest seemed alive with soundbirds calling from high branches, the rustle of leaves in the breeze, the constant murmur of the stream. It should have been peaceful, but there was something about the way the trees crowded close to the water, their roots twisting into the earth like claws, that kept me on edge. It was Sarah who spotted the first sign that something wasn't right. Hold up, she said, stopping so abruptly that Jake nearly bumped into her. What is it now? Jake asked, but his teasing tone faltered when he followed her gaze. The print was pressed into the mud at the water's edge, deep and unmistakable. It was larger than any human footprint, but it wasn't quite animal either. The shape was wrong elongated, with what looked like claw marks scoring the edges. What the hell is that? Jake said, stepping closer. Bear, Sarah suggested, though she didn't sound convinced. Matt crouched beside the print, his brow furrowing as he ran his fingers lightly along its edge. Maybe, but it's strange. How strange? I asked, my voice tight. He didn't answer immediately, his gaze fixed on the print. The claws are too long for a bear, he said finally. And the shape, it's off. Off how? Jake pressed, crossing his arms. Matt straightened, brushing his hands on his pants. I don't know. It just doesn't look right. We continued upstream, the mood shifting with every step. The laughter and banter from earlier had faded, replaced by a heavy, uneasy silence. Even Jake, who could joke his way through anything, seemed subdued, his eyes darting to the trees more often than not. The claw marks came next. Whoa, Sarah said, stopping abruptly again. She pointed to a tree trunk near the stream's edge, where deep gouges had been carved into the bark. They were jagged and uneven, cutting through the tree with a force that made my stomach twist. The marks started near the base and stretched upward, disappearing 10 feet above the ground. Bear, Matt said, though his tone lacked conviction. Bears don't climb that high, do they? I asked, staring at the marks. They can, he said slowly. But these are strange. Look how wide they are. The marks weren't just long, they were thick, the kind of gouges that would require claws larger and sharper than anything I could imagine. Sarah stepped back, her arms crossing over her chest. You're saying a bear did this? I'm saying I don't know, Matt replied, his voice steady but tight. Jake laughed nervously, running a hand through his hair. Maybe it's Bigfoot. Or his angry cousin. Not funny, Sarah snapped, her gaze darting toward the surrounding trees. The forest seemed different now, the trees leaning closer together, their branches tangled like twisted fingers. The sunlight struggled to pierce through the canopy, leaving the ground beneath us cloaked in a dim greenish haze. The stream, once cheerful and bubbling, now sounded muted, as though the forest itself were swallowing the noise. We found a small pool where the stream widened, the water so still it reflected the sky like a mirror. Jake dropped his pack and plopped down on a rock near the edge. Lunch, he announced, pulling out a sandwich. Because nothing says relaxing hike like creepy footprints and claw marks. Sarah didn't respond. She stayed standing, her eyes fixed on the far side of the pool, where the trees grew darker, thicker. Matt sat beside me, close enough that our knees brushed. He handed me a water bottle, his expression unreadable. You okay? He asked softly. I nodded, though the unease curling in my stomach hadn't eased. My mind kept circling back to the figurines, to the impossible detail of my carving. The way it had looked round and expectant, like it knew something I hadn't told anyone. Matt, I whispered, my voice trembling. Yeah? I hesitated, the words caught in my throat. Nothing, I said finally. He studied me for a moment, his brow furrowed, but he didn't press. Instead, he reached for my hand, his touch warm and steady. The hike back to camp was heavier than the one out, not just in the aching of our legs, but in the weight hanging over all of us. The unease that had crept in when we found the footprint hand deepened at the sight of the claw marks had taken root and grown, wrapping around us like vines. No one spoke much. Even Jake's usual bravado had withered to occasional muttered jokes that no one laughed at. Sarah, walking just ahead of me, stopped abruptly and turned on Jake. Can you please stop stomping through every puddle like a child? Jake froze mid-splash, his grin fading as he turned to face her. What's your problem? It's a stream, Sarah. It's water. You know, nature? That thing we came here to enjoy? My problem, Sarah snapped, is that I don't need you pretending this is some carefree holiday while we're finding weird-ass footprints and claw marks big enough to scare off a bear. Guys, don't, Matt said from behind me, his tone calm but firm. Don't what? Jake asked, throwing up his hands. Don't act like we're on vacation. We are. Or at least, we were supposed to be. But now we're jumping at shadows and... Because there's something to jump at, Sarah interrupted, her voice rising. You saw those marks, Jake. You saw that footprint. This isn't normal. I stopped walking, squeezing my temples as their argument grew louder. My stomach twisted with unease, not just because of the tension between them, but because they were right. It wasn't normal. The figurines were burned into my mind, especially the one of me. That small, rounded belly carved into the wood, the silent message it carried. No one could know. Not even Matt. And yet, whoever had made them did know. I just don't see why you're freaking out, Jake said, his voice cutting through my thoughts. Enough, I snapped, turning to face them. My voice was louder than I intended, and they both froze, staring at me. Just stop. Both of you. They exchanged a glance, neither looking particularly chastened, but at least they fell silent. I need a minute, I muttered, stepping off the trail and lowering myself onto a mossy rock by the stream. By the time we made our way back to camp, the forest felt different. The light had dimmed, the shadows stretching long and thin across the ground, and the air was thick with a strange, suffocating stillness. The tree at the edge of the clearing, the one that had held the figurines, was empty. I stopped in my tracks, staring up at the bare branches. Relief flooded through me, but it was short-lived. Maybe someone took them down, Matt said, his voice measured. Good, Jake muttered. They were creepy as hell. Sarah frowned, her gaze darting between the tree and the surrounding forest. Are we sure this is the same tree? It's the same tree, Matt said firmly. Let's just get back to camp, I said, my voice tight. When we stepped into the clearing, the world seemed to stop. The figurines were back. They weren't in the tree anymore. They hung from the guide ropes in front of our tents, swaying gently in the breeze. Jake and Sarah's figures hung in front of their tent, while Matt's and mine dangled from the ropes in front of ours. For a moment, none of us moved. My chest tightened as I stared at the carvings, their crude shapes catching the dim light. Something was different. The rough, unfinished look they'd had earlier was gone. The figures were more detailed now, their features sharper, more defined. And their faces... Oh my God, Sarah whispered. The faces were screaming. Each one was twisted in an expression of pure terror, their mouths open in silent cries, their eyes wide and desperate. The detail was so vivid it felt like the screams were still echoing in the air, faint and distorted, just out of earshot. But it wasn't just the faces. I stepped closer to the figure representing me, my breath catching in my throat. The rounded belly was more pronounced now, unmistakably pregnant, the curve smooth and deliberate. But there was something else. A red stain ran down the figurine's leg, dripping from the edge of the carving like blood. My legs felt weak, my stomach twisting violently as I stared at it. My hand went to my stomach, clutching at the fabric of my jacket. Lisa? Matt's voice was soft, concerned, but it felt distant, muffled. How? My voice cracked, the words barely audible. How did they know? What are you talking about? Sarah asked, her voice sharp. I couldn't answer. The world around me felt like it was spinning, the figurines' grotesque detail pulling me into some dark, suffocating void. Lisa, Matt said again, his hand squeezing my shoulder. His voice anchored me, pulling me out of the spiral. I looked up at him, then at the others. The truth was clawing its way out of me, and for the first time, I wasn't sure if keeping it inside was the safe choice. The instinct to survive that primal, animal part of me screamed that I had to tell them. They deserved to know. I deserved to know why this was happening. I swallowed hard, my voice trembling as I spoke. I think I'm pregnant. Matt's grip on my shoulder tightened slightly, and I glanced at him. His face was calm, but his eyes were wide, filled with a mix of concern and something else. Determination. It's okay, he said softly, his voice steady. We'll figure this out. I wanted to believe him, but the red stain on the figurine kept pulling my gaze back. It wasn't just the pregnancy it knew about, it was the blood. A grotesque omen carved into wood, mocking me with its impossible detail. I'm relighting the fire, Jake said suddenly, his voice breaking the tense silence. He turned away from us and crouched by the fire pit, striking a match against a rock. The sharp scent of sulfur filled the air, cutting through the earthy dampness of the forest. The flames flickered to life, small and weak at first, before catching on the dry kindling Jake had gathered. Great, Sarah muttered, throwing her hands up. Because a fire's really going to solve all this. Jake shot her a look but didn't respond, his focus on coaxing the flames higher. Sarah turned back to me, her gaze narrowing. Lisa, she said, her voice quieter, but no less intense. You need to do the test. Now. What? I asked, the word barely a whisper. If you're pregnant, Sarah said, stepping closer, we're going back. No arguments. There's no way anyone could have known about this, not unless someone's playing games with us. And if they are, we're not staying here to figure it out. Her words hung heavy in the still air. But before I could respond, Matt straightened and stepped forward. No, he said firmly, his voice cutting through the tension. Sarah blinked, caught off guard. What? Matt's jaw tightened, his eyes hardening. I've had enough. Of all of this. The figurines, the claw marks, the footprint, something isn't right here. I don't care what's going on. We're not staying another night. It's a long drive back, Jake muttered, still crouched by the fire. Then we'll drive all night, Matt shot back. I'm not risking it. You're overreacting, Sarah said, though her voice lacked its usual bite. Am I? Matt asked, his tone icy. Look around, Sarah. Look at those things. He pointed to the figurines, still swaying gently on the guide ropes. Does this feel normal to you? Because it doesn't to me. Sarah opened her mouth to argue, then closed it again, her gaze flicking back to the carvings. For the first time, her confidence faltered. I sat in silence, Matt's hand still gripping mine. The fire crackled faintly, casting long shadows across the clearing. The figurines loomed in the edges of the firelight, their screaming faces distorted by the flickering glow. Fine, Sarah said finally, her voice low. Do the test, Lisa. If it's positive, we leave. If it's not, she hesitated, glancing at the figurines again. We stay and figure out who's messing with us. Jake muttered something under his breath but didn't argue further. I swallowed hard, the weight of their stares pressing down on me. The test was in my backpack, hidden in a pocket I hadn't touched since we'd arrived. "Lisa," Matt said softly, kneeling beside me. His voice was gentle, but his eyes were firm. "Whatever happens, we'll deal with it. Together." I nodded, though the knot in my chest only tightened. The forest around us remained deathly silent, as though it were listening, waiting. The fire flickered weakly, casting strange, shifting patterns across the ground. I stood slowly, my legs trembling beneath me. The figurines swayed in the breeze, their wooden faces frozen in terror, as if they knew something none of us could yet understand. The forest had gone silent, not just quiet silent. No rustling leaves, no chirping insects, no distant calls of birds. Even the wind, which had teased the treetops all day, had stilled, leaving the air so heavy and motionless it felt like the trees were holding their breath. Jake crouched by the fire pit, a matchbook in his hands, muttering to himself as he struck match after match. The dry wood in the fire pit should have caught easily, but the matches wouldn't stay lit. Every time the tiny flames sparked to life, it died as if snuffed out by some unseen breath. "This is ridiculous," Jake muttered, striking another match. The flame flared, weak and fleeting, before winking out. He threw the spent match into the ash with a curse. "What the hell is going on? They're not wet." "Try again," Sarah said, her voice brittle. She stood near the edge of the clearing, her arms wrapped tightly around herself, her gaze darting toward the figurines still swaying on the guide ropes. "Just try again, Jake." "I'm trying," he snapped, striking another match. This one flared a little brighter, only to extinguish as though the forest itself had drawn in a breath and blown it out. The silence pressed down on us, so thick it felt like it had weight. My heartbeat thundered in my ears, the sound unnaturally loud in the oppressive stillness. I looked at Matt, my eyes searching his for reassurance. But his expression was grim, his jaw tight. He nodded toward the tent, his meaning clear. "Do the test." I didn't want to. My legs felt like lead as I forced myself to move, grabbing my backpack and walking behind the tent. The forest loomed around me, the trees seeming to stretch taller, their branches knitting together overhead. "Matt," I whispered, my voice shaking. He followed me, his footsteps crunching softly against the dirt. But his eyes weren't on me, they were on the trees, scanning the shadows with a sharp, restless intensity. He kept turning his head, his muscles taut, as if he expected something to step out of the darkness at any moment. "It's okay," he murmured, though his voice sounded far from convinced. I crouched down, fumbling with the zipper of my backpack. My fingers felt clumsy, shaking as I pulled out the slim plastic package. I could feel Matt standing behind me, his presence steady but tense. I forced myself to focus, to block out the eerie stillness around us. When I looked at the test a few minutes later, The result stared back at me. Clear and unrelenting. Positive. I stood slowly, the weight of the truth sinking into my chest like a stone. I turned to Matt, holding the test in trembling hands. His eyes met mine, and I saw the same realization settle over him. He nodded once, his jaw tightening. "We're packing up," he said. The clearing felt different when we stepped back into it, as though the forest had shifted in our absence. The figurines still hung from the guide ropes, their grotesque, screaming faces illuminated by the faint light of the fire pit's dying embers. Sarah looked at me, her eyes wide. "Well, it's positive," I said, my voice barely audible. Sarah didn't argue. She nodded sharply, her expression hardening. "Then we're leaving. Now." Jake let out a frustrated groan, throwing his hands up. "Seriously? We just got here. It's a long drive back, and—" "Shut up, Jake," Sarah snapped, her voice trembling. "We're leaving. Lisa's pregnant. Someone new. Someone's messing with us. And I'm not sticking around to find out who or how." Jake opened his mouth to argue, but the words didn't come. He looked around the clearing, his gaze lingering on the figurines. And for the first time, I saw real fear in his eyes. "Fine," he muttered, grabbing his pack. "Fine. Let's go." We started packing in frantic, jerky motions, but the air around us felt wrong, too still, too heavy. My hands shook as I stuffed clothes into my bag, glancing at the trees every few seconds. That's when the wind came. It wasn't a gradual thing. It came out of nowhere, whipping through the clearing with a force that took my breath away. Twigs and leaves flew through the air, pelting us like tiny missiles. The fire pit flared for a brief, terrifying moment, before dying completely, its embers scattered into the night. "What the hell?" Jake shouted, ducking as a branch flew past him. "It's the wind," Matt said, his voice low and tense. But even as he said it, I could see the doubt in his eyes. This wasn't normal wind. It wasn't the gusts you'd feel before a storm, playful and chaotic. This felt deliberate, malevolent. The trees groaned and creaked as the wind roared through them, their branches bending unnaturally low, as if reaching for us. "Go," Sarah screamed, abandoning her half-packed bag. "Just get to the car." Jake hesitated for a fraction of a second, his eyes darting toward the gear scattered around the clearing. "We can't just leave all this." "Forget it," Matt bellowed, grabbing my arm and pulling me toward the Toyota Land Cruiser. "We're leaving now." The wind grew stronger as we ran, the sound of it deafening. Twigs and stones flew through the air, slamming into us with enough force to sting. My legs burned as I stumbled toward the car, Matt's hand gripping mine tightly, pulling me along. The shadows in the forest seemed to shift and move, dark shapes twisting just beyond the edge of my vision. I didn't dare look too closely. We reached the car, throwing the doors open and piling inside. Matt jumped into the driver's seat, his hands shaking as he jammed the key into the ignition. Come on, he muttered, turning the key. The engine roared to life, a sound that felt like salvation. The wind howled around us, shaking the car as Matt threw it into gear and slammed his foot on the gas. The Land Cruiser lurched forward, its tires skidding slightly on the dirt before finding traction. The headlights cut through the darkness, illuminating the winding road ahead. As we tore out of the clearing, I glanced out the window, my breath hitching as I caught one last glimpse of the clearing. The figurines were still there, hanging from the guide ropes, their screaming faces turned toward us, as if watching us leave. No one spoke. The wind roared outside, chasing us down the road, its cries rising and falling like the wails of something furious and hungry. I squeezed Matt's hand, my fingers digging into his. His knuckles were white as he gripped the wheel, his eyes fixed on the road. "We're okay," he said, his voice trembling. "We're okay." But as the forest loomed around us, its twisted branches clawing at the sky, I wasn't sure I believed him. The words felt hollow, a fragile lie barely holding back the suffocating terror that clung to us. The Land Cruiser roared down the dirt road, its tires skidding slightly on the loose gravel, as the headlights carved a shaky path through the impenetrable darkness. The forest loomed around us, vast and unending, its twisted branches clawing at the sky like skeletal hands. The wind howled, relentless, battering the vehicle as if the forest itself had come alive to stop us from leaving. I wanted to believe Matt. I wanted to believe that once we were out of the forest, everything would go back to normal. But deep down, I knew the forest wasn't done with us. And then, the pain hit. It started as a dull cramp low in my stomach, but within seconds it sharpened, blooming into a twisting, agonizing ache that made me double over in my seat. My breath hitched, and I clutched at my abdomen, the pain radiating outward like fire. "Lisa," Matt's voice was frantic, his eyes darting between me and the road. "What's wrong?" I couldn't answer. My vision blurred as the pain intensified, white-hot and unrelenting. And then I felt it, a warm, wet trickle running down my leg. "No," I whispered, my voice barely audible. "What?" Matt asked, panic rising in his voice. I couldn't bring myself to say it out loud. The truth was too terrible, too raw. The forest had known I was pregnant. It had known before I did. And now, it knew I was losing the baby. Or, had it wanted this all along? The thoughts spiraled through my mind, jagged and relentless. Had the forest taken my baby? Had it wanted the life inside me, something innocent and pure, as some kind of offering? A sacrifice? Or had it simply been its way of punishing us for daring to leave? My chest tightened, the pain in my stomach twisting into something darker, something deeper. I clung to Matt's hand, my nails digging into his skin, as the Land Cruiser sped through the suffocating darkness. "It's going to be okay," he said, his voice shaking. "You're going to be okay." But as the warmth continued to seep down my leg, soaking into the fabric of my jeans. I wasn't sure if I believed him. Epilogue. 3 months later. The events of that night didn't leave us when we left the forest. They followed us, clinging like shadows, their weight pressing down on each of us in different ways. I sat on the edge of my bed, staring at the pregnancy test in my hand. Negative. Again. The doctors had said there was no reason I couldn't conceive again. The miscarriage had been unexplained. A cruel twist of fate. But deep down, I knew the truth. The forest had taken something from me, and it hadn't just been the baby. It had taken my hope. Every night, I dreamed of the figurine, the rounded belly, the red stain running down its leg. And every time, I woke gasping, clutching my stomach, convinced I could still feel the phantom pain. Matt tried to comfort me, but even he couldn't reach me anymore. Not really. The worst part wasn't the grief. It was the knowing. Knowing that the forest had wanted something from me, and it had taken it. Matt. Matt buried himself in work. He was quieter now, more serious. The easygoing, steady man I'd fallen in love with had been replaced by someone harder. Someone who flinched at the sound of breaking branches, or the rustle of leaves on a windy day. He never talked about the forest, but I could see it in his eyes. He carried it with him, just like I did. Sometimes, at night, I'd wake to find him staring out the window, his jaw tight, his hands clenched into fists. He never said what he was looking for, but I knew. He was waiting. Sarah. Sarah hadn't been herself since we left the forest. She'd always been the planner, the one with the solution for everything. But now, she seemed lost, her sharp edges dulled by fear. She'd started seeing a therapist, though she wouldn't admit it at first. When I asked her how she was doing, she'd force a smile and say, "Fine." But I knew the truth. Sarah wasn't fine. None of us were. Jake was the one who changed the most. He'd always been loud, confident, the life of the party. But after that night, he stopped joking. He didn't go out anymore. He quit his job, moved back in with his parents, and spent most of his time drinking. The last time I saw him, he'd been sitting in his parents' backyard, staring into the woods that bordered their property. "They're still watching us," he'd said, his voice barely above a whisper. "You know that, right? They're still out there." I didn't know what to say. The forest hasn't left us. Even now, months later, I can feel it. When the wind rises, carrying the scent of pine and earth, it whispers to me, low and insistent. Sometimes, when I close my eyes, I can see it. Those twisted branches reaching for the sky, those screaming figurines swaying in the breeze. It's still out there, waiting. And no matter how far we run, how much time passes, I know it will always be with us. It wanted something from us that day, and it got it. But I can't shake the feeling that it wasn't done. that it isn't done.